to our sound and editing wizard Ben, and of course to all of our listeners. We're on LinkedIn.
Did you just mix up LinkedIn and Twitter? What? Yeah, I'm going to say that's quite exciting. That maybe we've just hit on a business model.
Welcome to Cloud Realities, a conversation show exploring the practical and exciting alternate realities that can be unleashed through cloud-driven transformation. I'm Dave Chapman.
I'm Sjoukje Rob.
And I'm Rob Kernahan.
This week we'll be taking a view on how to become a data-driven organisation. What are the steps that you need to take, and what are some of the challenges that you need to overcome? And actually, what's the scale of organisation you need to be in place to become a data product organisation? Joining us this week, I'm delighted to say, is Mark Jones. He's the Head of Engineering for Data and Analytics at Reach, UK's largest commercial, national and regional news publisher. Mark, welcome. Great to see you. Do you just want to introduce yourself and say a little bit about Reach?
Hello. Thank you very much for having me. Reach, as we've mentioned, is a large news publisher. We have a variety of print titles and obviously a lot of websites and digital properties. We're doing a lot of interesting things with technology and data in particular.
Let's get a start, Mark, by just digging right into Reach and how they're using data. So why don't you just, before we sort of drill into the complexity of actually, making your data make sense and making it work for you, tell us a little bit about what Reach is actually trying to do with data and how you're trying to leverage it.
So Reach is the largest commercial national regional news publisher. We have lots of print media, but a very large digital presence. It's news. So we've got everything from online websites like the Mirror and the Express through to regional things like Cheshire Live, North Wales Live, My London, that kind of thing. So there's a huge digital footprint. And obviously we've got a lot of content that we want to get in front of the right people. So, going to our purpose, Reach's purpose is to enlighten and empower and entertain through journalism, and that's all underpinned by data. So it's about making sure that we provide relevant content and more engaging experiences to our customers so that they remain engaged with us. We build a deeper relationship with them. We show them news that's important to them, and that's basically at a national and a local level. So, obviously if we want to be able to show you things like local news, such as our In Your Area brand, we need to know where you live. So a lot of that is about value exchange between us and our customers.
Would that be, I go to the website of, say, one of your publications and I would get content that's aggregated from all of your publications into that one brand front end?
No. So the brand front end are separate. So we do obviously see what you're doing with each of the brands, but there's also the opportunity for us to have like an aggregator brand like In Your Area, which lets you put in where you live and brings together content from across all of that space.
I see.
But what's really powerful for us with the data is if you tell us more about you, then we can serve you up more content that we think you would be interested in. So we can say, here's a story that would be interested in, here's something that impacts your particular area. And in return, that's kind of the value exchange, really, which is if you tell us a bit more about you, we will give you, more relevant content and we can recommend things for you. So we do a lot of stuff around recommendation and other data-driven tools. So, what you're interacting with, do you want to see more things like that? Are there related topics that would be interesting to you? And obviously on the other end of that, we are funded by advertising. So we in terms of it's not just, you don't just pay for physical papers. Obviously, when you visit our websites, we show you adverts. We want to make sure that they are tailored to you and that, they're relevant to you. And so that we can both make it so that it's not something that's going to frustrate our customers, but also has a better yield for us.
Right. And just, again, before we go and dig into some of the architecture behind that and such, then the challenges, just briefly, your team in the middle of that, how are you structured around providing data services to that ecosystem?
So I sit within the wider data and analytics team, which has the kind of standard teams you'd expect to see. There's a BI team, there's data scientists, there's a data management team, etc. I look after the data engineering side of things. I've got multiple sort of sub teams in there. So I've got a platform team that is responsible for running all of our data platforms and for ingesting data into our lake. So data platforms are things like our lake, our enterprise warehouse, reporting tools, that kind of thing. So obviously that's the core of it. I've then got a data services team which provides services to the business based around data. So that's things like APIs to consume and also to provide data, as well as applications to help with the maintenance of that data, as well as tools to help drive some value for the business around that in terms of things like newsletter subscriptions and what have you. I've also got another team which is responsible for actually loading data into the EDW and doing the transformations in there. And I've got a team that's responsible for all the machine learning engineering, and they are very, very clever individuals. Not that everybody else isn't, but those guys in particular are really good at what they do. And they drive all the things like the recommenders on the site. So obviously the data scientists come up with the different sort of mechanisms that they want to use in the algorithms, but in terms of how does that get productionized and how do we run experimentation and A/B tests on different recommenders, all sits with them. And then finally, I've got another team which is looking after internal data products.
Very cool. So if you step back then and look at how you're trying to leverage data across the digital front end, and quite a complex digital front end with a number of different brands and requirements going on within it, where would you say the organization is on its data journey, and maybe like in maturity terms? So are you like level 4, 5 data maturity, or are you actually on a journey towards that?
I think we're on the journey towards that. I think different areas are at different maturity levels, and I would say that's the same for every organisation. I don't think I've ever been in any organisation that can claim to be at level maturity 5 for anything.
Like almost everybody feels like one. It feels like we've made hardly any progress. It's really, really hard.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think in terms of where we are, I think we're in a good place. We've got a good foundation in terms of our infrastructure. So we've got a good set of data platforms in there. We're happy with the technology. We've got patterns and standards for ingesting data and transforming it. And obviously we're doing some very advanced things with that data in terms of machine learning algorithms and other bits and pieces. So I'm quite happy with that. I think data governance is a good area as well. We take it very seriously. So people inside Reach understand the value of our data and also the need to make sure it's used appropriately and kept safe and secure, which I think is very good because not all organizations take data quite so seriously in terms of that. I think where we could be better is I'm very keen on self-service, but to do self-service, you've got to have a huge amount of collateral in terms of data catalogs, data lineage, documentation, that kind of thing. So I think we could improve in those areas, but I'm pretty happy with where we are in terms of the capabilities we're providing and that we've got the right foundation to go to our next stage of growth.
It sounds pretty mature to me, Mark.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, it does. And I was going to say, was there a point when the business really cottoned on to the power of data? It sounds like it happened a while ago because you're well on your data journey. Was there a threshold moment, or was it something that there was a flywheel effect that went on slowly? They understood that if you apply this stuff more and more, suddenly there is a really good reason to use it as part of your business model.
So I think that happened. Unfortunately, that happened before I joined Reach, I think, so it's quite hard for me to talk to about that. But I think there's definite awareness. And one of the reasons I actually joined Reach was that the second point on their sort of strategy was data-led proposition. And so to see something like data as the second point on a corporate strategy is actually very rare in my experience. Usually you'll see there's 4 or 5 key things, and then there'll be something in a blurb at the bottom of your average company thing saying, oh, yes, and we will use
we have some data.
Yeah.
Whereas, we mustn't forget about data, yeah.
That's it. Whereas what I really like about Reach is they're very upfront and say, this is really important. Obviously, the journalism's the most important thing, but data's number 2, and I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's the same as security in many organisations where we best put security on that statement as well, because that's important.
Exactly, yeah.
So I'm interested in reflecting on the journey to this point then. So what have been the sort of core challenges and hurdles that you've had to overcome? Presumably one of them at least must have been aggregating data in the first place, given that you've got multiple brands, which I assume at one point will have been multiple different publications. Just tell us a little bit about the journey to here.
Sure. So it started off, again, before my time with the data lake, and then there was the initial parts of an enterprise data warehouse. And so it was very focused on sort of capturing data. What it's about now is, I think, where we've tried to get to is how do we make it so that we can combine that data, because there's lots of different disparate sources. And so the challenges are, how do you get all of that data? How do you know what you need and what has value, and how do you get it in quickly? And obviously that's where data lakes help, because ingestion is a bit easier. But the problem is then when you do find that data is valuable, you need to transform it and make sure it's available so that people can actually use that. And I think in terms of one of the big challenges, it's about sort of how do you do identity resolution across websites and different systems. So we obviously have we have some tools that centralize things around user accounts, but you appear in so many other systems. So you appear in web tracking systems, you appear in an email system, there's lots of different things. Plus you've got things like AdTech and MarTech systems. And so how do you identify a user across all of that estate? It has been a big challenge that we've got a reasonable solution to. And so it's not just that, but also how do you transform and clean data? Because I'm sure, as you've probably all encountered, you go off, you scrape a bunch of data out of a system. That's fantastic. You can report on it. Then all the anomalies are discovered. One of these fields isn't very well populated. Somebody's put Jeff in there as their date of birth. If you haven't got the right validation in place. So it's how do you get to this whole thing of not just how do you cleanse data after the fact, but how do you make sure that you can feed that stuff in and work with your partners across the business to put things like validation in the source.
And maybe actually we could just dwell on that a little bit, because the clearing up problem and the inconsistency problem, I think, lies at the root of why most organizations tend to find a data journey extremely difficult. There's another governance layer to that in a second, which I think we'll come to. But I'm just interested in how you guys got after that. Was it literally like a hard yards, sleeves rolled up, almost physical exercise? Or did you manage to create some automation around it? Maybe just go a level deeper on how you actually rooted that out.
Sure. So our data management team were responsible for looking for a lot of data quality stuff. So they do a lot of good stuff around sort of producing quality reports, where they report on some of the metrics in terms of key fields, what they populated, what's their correctness, and that kind of thing. And that has helped to drive us to sort of prioritize sort of engineering tasks.
So you started with sort of case study, like these are the sort of views that we need, like business driven perspective on it, rather than data model up, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, and I can't take credit for that, in fairness. The head of data management's done a really good job in that area. The engineers have then responded with that and said, okay, well, we can obviously do some clearing up. We can try and identify where these things have come from, because, of course, it comes back down to lineage, doesn't it? Of, well, actually, you've got this wrong field over here. Where did it come from? Where was the problem introduced? Often it's at source. And then, of course, it's how do you work with your colleagues in product across, because we've got product managers across the whole piece to get them to prioritize and put things like validation steps in and that kind of thing.
And do you feel like you've got over that data trust issue? Often when you start this type of journey, there's some reticence to trust the data because of all the issues that you talk about, where if I use this data in the wild and push it out to a consumer, if I get it wrong, that's a bad thing. But if I get it right, it can be an extremely compelling experience. I
think so. I think a lot of it comes down to how reliable is the source system. Yeah. So part of the thing is that the key thing is to make sure people don't perceive data as a whole. Yeah. You have to be able to educate the consumers and say, well, look, there's different tiers of systems, and there's also different levels of reliability, because you get into things like, when you talk about things like, so everyone's very keen on things like single version of truth as an example, but every organization has multiple versions of truth, because often what you'll see is most organizations have multiple ways of tracking user behavior and visits. In my experience, so you'll often see there's like a core central one, and then there's companies often have GA because you end up integrate with AdWords. So it's about being able to articulate and say, these data sets are clean and they are reliable. These may be less so, but there's still value. But it's how do you tier those systems, and how, because you have finite resource as well, which is how do you make sure that you, instead of spreading yourself thin across all systems trying to get to a certain level of quality, you need to make sure that obviously things that are going to be used for things like financial planning and business strategy are, absolutely rock solid, and other things that provide useful insights about certain things are perhaps, less focused on.
Do you find that puts a lot of pressure on the quality of the algorithm that you build, so that understanding of which data set is absolutely the truth and others which may not be quite correct? So you've got this massively distributed view, responsibility of multiple organizations. You've got to consolidate that together and then serve an experience out. There must be quite a lot of pressure on the quality of the algorithms that you use, and how you constantly tweak them as the data sets move around you that may not be completely under your control.
To a certain extent. So obviously in terms of gathering data and processing and putting it into general reporting, that's fairly straightforward. And in terms of we can apply standardized set of rules across things. When you get into the usage of that data for things like recommenders, that becomes much more nuanced, and what's the appropriate things to use is something that the data scientists and machine learning engineers are experts in, and they know how to go through that and identify. And that's where things like testing becomes really important, because how do you experiment with that and see whether or not an approach or a new feature is going to yield a better result in terms of people clicking through and seeing more stuff, as opposed to in an engineering perspective and a reporting perspective, it's fairly straightforward to turn around and say, does this data match this rule? does this data provide us additional value is a more difficult question to answer.
Just returning to your journey then, and your journey to here, we dwelt there a little bit on the data cleansing issue. What are the other elements that have taken you to the point of maturity that you're at?
So I think it's about making sure that you've got clear roles and responsibilities. I think team structure is really important. Not necessarily in terms of there is only one structure to do it, but when you do settle on it, you've got very clear roles and responsibilities for teams. So there's multiple ways of doing that. So for us, we are tended to focus more on particular areas. So it's kind of a bit more of a vertical split to a certain extent for a lot of the team. So there's a team that looks after the platforms and data lake. There's another one that's looking after the EDW. There's another one that's looking after some data services stuff around that. So things like apps for our business users and APIs for services.
It might seem like an obvious question, but why is that structure working for you? What is it about that sort of shape that means that it's pushing forward the agenda around data?
I think it's working for us because it enables us to have clear roles and responsibilities, and we're able to align that around the people that we have and the skills we want to build. Because you get into this whole thing of, well, you can go the other way and say, well, you can go with completely cross-functional teams as an example, and try to look at things like data mesh and data products. And I think I think data products is absolutely the best way to do that, but you need a very large, very mature organization for that to work, because you can't build something like a data mesh without every team involved in that understanding a lot about data in terms of a platform level and transformation.
And just for listeners who maybe don't have a mental model of what a data product structure would look like, maybe just give us a sense of what that would look like so we can compare the two.
So a data product is when you decide that you want to try and introduce product thinking. So a lot of this got publicised quite widely with the excellent paper. I can't remember the author's name about data meshes. So the idea was that you would treat data as a product in the same way that you would treat things like website areas as a product. So for example, if you were running like a retail website, you might have things like product pages or the customer onboarding as like a product that somebody looks after. You might have something like logistics as another product that somebody looks after, or an area, and so you'd have those products as we look after the logistics chain. We provide logistics services to the business, we provide customer onboarding, we provide product information, that kind of thing. So you could have those as different product teams. It's probably not the best explanation I've given, but hopefully it suffices.
It's also a more sort of blended skill within a
absolutely, yes. So the whole idea of cross-disciplinary teams, whereby each of those teams has got back-end engineers, front-end engineers, testers, BAs, delivery managers, etc. The idea with data products is you also go there with data, and potentially you can either have separate things, or more likely you try and say that data is part of that product. So what happens there is I could say, well, if I was responsible for, say, the logistics data or the logistics function, I will provide logistics data products which tell you things like stock levels as a data product, and warehouses and delivery lead times and things like that. And so I could create that data set as a sort of mini data lake, if you like, and say I will publish all these things here, and these are high quality pieces of information, as opposed to the traditional model, which is that it's just exported or left in a database somewhere and a central data team collects that. Now, to get to that level, you've got to have a lot of organizational maturity in terms of product management and a lot of data skills in each of those teams. Unfortunately, at the moment, data skills are still relatively rare compared to general software engineering. It's still quite a very specific specialism. So you end up with quite large things, and quite large teams. And where do you get to in terms of things like economies of scale? Because that's always the trade-off, which is, do you have cross-disciplinary teams that can do everything, or do you have certain centers of excellence? And it's a bit like DevOps as an example, which is a principle in terms of, you want developers to operate their code and be able to write infrastructure as code and that sort of stuff. What often happens is you have a small central team of DevOps as well that are responsible for looking at overall management of your cloud estate, is the thing that I've seen. Now, obviously, you guys know much more about this than I do, so I don't know if you've seen that kind of model where you have a mix of embedded resource and central teams at the centre of excellences.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely the adage products and platforms. So platforms give you capability, products serve the business. The beautiful thing you talk about there with the data as the product is, the business understand what you're serving them, and they can value it and they can govern it because you're serving it to them in a way that they understand it. So it's not just random technology in the corner that does magic. It is, I understand that function that gives me because it helps me achieve my role and my job and my outcome. I think the power of the product is permeating throughout the IT organization because it helps bring that fusion of business and technology together, because everybody understands its same lexicon, same language, and you can talk about the same topic. So it's a powerful thing. And I think the maturity is, as you say, you're well on your maturity journey, and shows the sophistication that you built into your operating model to show that you can value and govern and exploit the data that you've got.
I think also one of the reasons for centralizing it is because ultimately data becomes really valuable when you combine it together. And that's why we're seeing lots of interesting things like data fabrics. And so kind of having teams with specialists that can bring all of that data together and in a way and expose it, it kind of makes a more natural sense for me, particularly around things like enterprise data warehousing. So I think unless you've got a very large organization with a lot of engineering clout across each of the different divisions, centralization is a good starting point.
So I want to talk briefly then about the governance structure you've got in around the data and how you're linking, say, like data infrastructure concerns and data clarity to business objective.
So one of the key things is obviously we want to make sure that we are processing data in a way that is in line with the various regulations, but also in ways that are sensible. And so what I mean by that is, there are certain things you're allowed to, so you're allowed to process data in terms of legitimate interest and in terms of consent, but also you want to make sure that you're doing things that are sensible with that data. So not just in terms of making sure that you're treating customers fairly and that kind of thing, but around the stuff of if you're trying to determine something, make sure you're using the right data to do that. Because one of the problems is that you get this sort of misunderstanding of people talking about things like correlation implies causation, where they go, well, I've plotted these two disparate points together and therefore this is happening, and you've used the wrong data and you've got completely the wrong conclusion. So it's about making sure that our data governance covers off, is there a data protection impact assessment in place? Is this project using data in a way that it's allowed to? Can we source the data we need to actually answer this question or provide this particular value? Because obviously one of the things we're trying to do is say, can we use data to tell us X, or we want to know why. Have we got the data to do that? Can we use that data in terms of we think it's the right thing to do, and there's legal basis for the processing and that kind of thing, and is that data reliable? And it's kind of hard to talk about it in sort of general terms, because obviously it really does depend on exactly what you're trying to answer and what data you have, and so it does vary per project. But you have to sort of look at it and turn around and say, well, it's almost like a little mini feasibility study, really, which is it feasible to use this data for this purpose, and have we got the right checks in there, and how do we get an answer on that, like a finger in the air idea of that before we start an initiative.
And do you find the business are the ones now requesting, is it feasible to, or is it the tech and the scientists going, did you know it might be feasible to? Which way is the pull coming from in your experience?
So we get a lot of it from the business. Now, I can't talk to a lot of that because there is a separate sort of BI function that looks after that mainly. But obviously, we know we get requests in from them, and we do get some directly from stakeholders of systems. So the business is very interested, as they are in anything. It's just, well, this thing has happened. What can you tell us about it?
Yeah.
Or we want to understand this, or can we use data to determine if we did this particular action, we would see an uptick in positive behaviours or something like that.
But that's quite powerful when the business have the data curiosity and they're coming to you because they understand the potential that you can serve to them. So that's that psychological, or I should say maturity step that happens in the business that says, hang on a minute, I can value this data and then I can exploit it and get more out of it. And that's a nice thing to see that they get excited about it as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Casting the net forward then, what do you think the next couple of years look like? And have you set out a vision for what data usage in the organization looks like?
So, yeah, in particular from the engineering point of view, what I'm interested in is making sure that we ingest as much data as possible, and we try to move more stuff to real-time ingestion, because I think that's where some of the real power is coming from. So obviously, if you go back 10, 15 years, a lot of data ingestion was just done as batch. But now that we see there's so many things now that exist that enable us to do real-time stuff, it's about trying to move as much of that into real-time ingestion, because not only can we then ingest that and do our standard daily reporting and that kind of thing, but you have an opportunity to react to signals and things as they happen. And I think things like streaming analytics are going to become really interesting and really powerful. So if you look at things like, event-driven models and, so Kafka, for example, has been a classic thing for this, and that's been around a while. And I remember using it very early on. The ability to basically pump all of your data into a central topic and then start to look at signals is really useful, particularly if you look at like streaming analytics and Windows, where you turn around and say, well, and so, for example, if I use like a retail example, if you can see somebody putting things into a basket, and then you notice that they've dropped off the site, the ability to do things like to try and re-engage them and abandoned basket type stuff is really powerful. For us, things like people looking at content give us real-time signals on and allow us to change our recommendations on what you should look at next. So, you've read this story about politics or, a scandal or Love Island or whatever. Maybe you'd be interested in this thing. So there's all that sort of stuff that can happen at an operational level. But also, if you think about things like anomaly detection, that becomes really powerful if you can stream that data. The big challenge there is, of course, having sources that can actually stream that data to you. So internally, that's not a problem because you can do a lot of stuff with events. But when you're dealing with third-party systems, not all of them are rigged up for that. And that is changing. And so we're seeing things like there's much more stuff in terms of being able to set up webhooks and API calls within various third-party platforms. But I think that's where I see a lot of investment going in terms of trying to get that data in as fast as possible, as well as more around governance.
Good sketch there, I think, then, of an organization that's actually probably well into 3 or 4 level maturity, I would say, in the way you describe it, in terms of organized around it, more than the first few steps in terms of clearing up the data and getting it in the right place, and actually clarity on what the path forward looks like. So, I think I really do think I think to Sjoukje's point earlier, it feels like a pretty mature setup with a clear direction forward. And probably a number of other organizations would look at that and probably go, God, I wish I was there.
Envious eyes, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So what advice would you give people who are beginning this journey and actually maybe a bit bogged down and, clearing up the data or something along those lines?
I think I would suggest by starting small and come up with a clear goal. So just don't try and boil the ocean is something that I think is always really important. I like the creation of things like exemplars, isn't it? So this idea of saying, well, let's find a use case and let's try and deliver that to the best of our ability, rather than try and play whack-a-mole with data quality issues across the entire estate. So pick a question you want to answer, and that could be something as nebulous as like what's customer lifetime value, up to or things like if you're dealing with, say, like retailers, it might be something like logistic turnaround times or goods lost in transit or that kind of thing. And to take a use case like that where you think you can probably get the data you need and build out something that enables you to do that. So you can build all the right things and build that up, because I think it's far better to start off with one small product that is high quality than attempt to try and just raise the bar on everything. So it would be things like build out a really good platform to enable that, build out all the most important thing with that is all the documentation, the cataloging, the lineage, the descriptions of that data, because if you want to get to the point of self-service, people have to understand data and know what they want to do. And if all you've got is a set of tables or like a Tableau dashboard and a data set behind it with no description of what those things are, you're never going to drive that change. So it's about giving people the skills and the information they need, rather than having the best possible, most efficient ETL pipeline.
Sjoukje, what have you been looking at this week?
So each week I will do some research on what's trending in tech, and this week I want to focus on why becoming a data-driven organization is so extremely hard. So being a data-driven organization has been a priority for many organizations for decades now, but we have seen mixed results in that. And why is that? So according to a survey of executives, company culture is a harder hurdle to clear than any technical problem that they have. And on top of that, the continuing explosion of the amount of data and also the growing concerns of privacy and data ownership makes this more difficult as well. But there are a couple of principles that you can keep in mind when you do want to become a successful data-driven organization. And these are, firstly, you really need to think different because it requires a different mindset to become a data-driven organization. And you also need to fail fast and learn faster as well. Learn through experience, which often entails trial and error. And lastly, you need to focus on the long term because it's a transformation effort that really unfolds over time. So I have a question to you, Mark. Did you also apply these principles to your organization?
Yeah, I think a lot of them. I think one of the problems is going back to saying about thinking differently with engineering, for example, with software engineering, you're very focused on things that you can easily unit test and integration test, and you're not worried so much about state is the main thing. Whereas obviously with data, it's all about state. So again, you can unit test functions, and transformations work very well as functional processes and that kind of thing. So it's easy to unit test some of those. But it's when you get into, well, if you make a mistake or you need to go and reprocess or reacquire some data, you could be going off to get multiple terabytes, and that isn't something that you're going to basically load in an afternoon. So I think those kind of things are difficult. I think the challenges you mentioned around sort of governance and ownership are key as well. I think it's very hard to govern effectively if you aren't clear on who your data owners are and what you can and can't do with that data and what the nature of the consent is. And people, particularly product managers, have to understand what data has been consented to be done with, because just because you've got a piece of data doesn't mean you can do whatever you want with it. You've got very strict rules on what people have consented for you to do with that data. And I think that's another big challenge, as well as getting people who are owners, as I said earlier. So
how did you bed that in, Mark? Was that something that was part of a human-to-human governance conversation, or are you managing to build that into the logic of the platform somewhere?
So obviously we have things where we capture consent. A lot of it is about understanding that projects are doing the right thing with that data, and so we've got obviously we've got a data protection office, we've got a data management function. The engineers are well versed. Everybody's well versed and understands what our responsibilities are for data, partly through corporate training, but also through the experience that's built up over time around this.
And focusing on the long term, how long are you already into that transformation from a data perspective?
Oh, we're many years in. I think it'll never end, but I think we are many years in, so that's why we're reasonably mature. I think it's difficult because obviously the number of data sources will only grow, the volume of data will only grow, and like any other engineering discipline, particularly in software engineering, technology is constantly changing, and I think part of the problem is going to be, because we are several years in, it's at the time where we're looking at refreshing our technology estate and reevaluating where we are, and that gives you a bit of a headwind, because you're now have we still got the right platforms we need? Do we need to be considering what future platforms can give us? Because if you look at data warehousing now compared to 10, 15 years ago, it's predominantly in the cloud.
I think the point you make about it never ends is absolutely spot on. As organizations go on their journeys, whether it's a data transformation or whether it's a cloud transformation or whether it's the other D word, the digital transformation, I think what a lot of organizations miss is the switch into a new way of working, that more sort of exploratory, constantly innovating, constantly engaged way of working is not the transformation journey. That's the end state. And the exploration continues, right?
Absolutely.
Also, at the end of your point, you were saying now about it is predominantly in the cloud. Where are you on the cloud journey? Is it something that you guys are now looking at, or is it already done?
We're done. We're all in the cloud. The challenge with it is, of course, obviously, as cloud services grow and more things become available, what do you look to adopt? So, for example, there's a lot. AWS, which is our main cloud, is always introducing new services. How do you find the time to evaluate those and look at what those changes are, and if you should adopt them, as opposed to just ignoring them and staying focused on doing something else? So rather than choosing to adopt a new service, should you invest back in something you've already adopted?
Not being like bright light, bright light, bright light, bright light, bright light, bright light. That's the innovation.
The magpies of cloud.
Yeah, I was going to say,
double click on yes, I'll have a bit of that. Thank you very much.
I'm as prone to magpie development as the next person, and it is a challenge.
Yeah. I think it's that thing, though, that is that everybody went to cloud and went, great, this is new, fresh, evergreen, but then realised that actually cloud now has an issue with technical debt. or backlogs that say we did all that stuff, but we haven't kept it up to date, etc. And there's this new cycle of, hang on a minute, some of the things that we used to associate with legacy technology are now ideas that we still have to keep very conscious in our mind with cloud as well, to stop that magpie effect causing proliferation of technology and then just a chaos, basically. It sounds like you've got good control over that, but is there anything in particular you've got around the best way to do that so that the engineers get the technology they need, but you prevent proliferation of things that you don't need?
We have clear rules on what engineers are allowed, what their remit is and what they can do in terms of technology. So what requires architecture governance and what doesn't. So, we don't want to be really prescriptive in terms of blueprinting everything. So you don't want to get into an argument over which JSON parsing library is the best one to use and that kind of thing. Engineers know that and they can solve that on their own.
Rob loves that sort of conversation, Mark. You're on really thin ice here.
I'm worried if we get into it, you won't have any listeners left.
But Don't get stuck next to me at a dinner party, people.
Me too, Mark. Me too, on the listener's pipe.
So those kind of things you want to leave at a level, and certain services you can whitelist if you like, in terms of, I should say, allow list. So there are a bunch of things you can sort of pre-approve, if you like, for people to be able to use and not be too restrictive. I tend to draw the lines of programming languages because I think there needs to be conversations about that, because what you don't want is 20 engineers and 20 programming languages and then somebody leaves and we can't maintain something else, and that kind of thing. You don't want a very low bust factor for your team. What we do want is to enable the right amount of self-direction and autonomy in a role. So that's why I say we try to pre-approve things and say, well, these technologies, yep, you can use those as you see fit. You can't change cloud on a whim. So we don't want to come in one day and find out everybody's migrated off into Azure or GCP or something like that without telling anybody.
Although that would be a massive governance failure when it's a surprise in the morning with migrated cloud.
The FinOps team would be like,
I've
done what? What about the reserved instances?
I love the idea of an engineer just going, yeah, all right, let's do it Friday night. Yeah, let's go.
I do know of an organisation that happened to, actually.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, my word. Moved cloud. Oh, shit. You'd be like, what's the meeting on the Monday morning when you find out? You go, you've done what now? Hey?
My understanding was that there was a robust conversation. Luckily, I wasn't anywhere near that. I wasn't in that organisation at the time. But, yeah.
Well, Mark, look, thank you for that. I think on that note, the note of cloud chaos, we'll draw our conversation to a bit of a close. So, Mark, thanks so much for spending some time with us and sharing your insights and journey. Been a great chat.
Thank you very much for having me.
Pleasure. Now, we end every episode of the show by asking our guest what they're excited about doing next. Now, that could be watching the new Ed Sheeran documentary on Disney Plus, for example, all the way through to something you're excited about in your professional life. So, Mark, what are you excited about doing next?
I suppose this is kind of sad, but I'm actually quite excited. I want to play around with some LLMs, so I'm very interested in seeing what GitHub Copilot.
I thought I gave you enough warning about Rob's interest in this earlier, Mark. God, you again. I'm feeling at risk.
I'm sorry. I'm just really interested in seeing whether or not it lives up to the hype. Because I've seen some very interesting things. So I know that it can obviously stitch words together. And I know there's been some interesting research done into LLMs are great because they can generate a lot of text, but they don't necessarily know what's going on. I kind of want to try that for myself, really. 'Cause it just seems like really interesting when you read like the articles about how it can generate some quite complicated code and some other things. But then it falls down when you ask like ChatGPT questions about, I think there was one, some researchers asked it, what's better as a hairnet if you're working at a fast food restaurant, a used wrapper or a bun? And it suggested the bun because it didn't understand the other thing. Like, so I just kind of want to kick the tires on it and play with it, if that makes sense.
It fully does, yeah. And as sophisticated as it is not actual intelligence, at least not yet. So I think you're right. Its ability to distinguish around these things, when it's asked to distinguish, I think is still lacking at the moment, thankfully. But yes, a few years ahead of us, I think, with technologies like that are actually very unpredictable, both in terms of the power it will ultimately get to, but then something that concerns us on the show quite a lot at the moment is like the duty of care that also needs to come into using it appropriately. Not necessarily because it will, lead to a Terminator 2 style singularity moment, though it might. It's more about the actual societal impacts that we'll have on the way to that, if you see what I mean.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. I think it's going to be very, very interesting times.
Fascinating stuff. So, Mark, thanks again for joining us. A brilliant conversation.
So a huge thanks to our guest this week, Mark. Thank you so much for being on the show. We're on LinkedIn and Twitter, Dave Chapman, Rob Kernahan, and Sjoukje Rob. Feel free to follow or connect with us and let us know if you have any ideas for the show. And of course, if you haven't already done that, rate and subscribe to our podcast. See you in another reality next week.